Hello, friends. Today we'll be reading Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, there was a small village nestled up to an enchanted wood. Back then, it wasn't at all uncommon for these enchanted woods to be next to villages, though you hardly see them today. In the village near the baker's shop sat a small, happy little home. And in this home lived a very special girl named Little Red Riding Hood. Of course, that was not her birth name, but no one ever called her anything else. You see, when Red was a little bit younger, her grandmother had made her a beautiful red cape or riding hood. It was made of fine materials and hand embroidered with gold thread. It was quite the most beautiful hood that any of the villagers had ever seen, and Red never was seen without it. So eventually, that became her name, Little Red Riding Hood. Now, next to the village, in the enchanted wood, is where Red's grandmother lived. In fact, she lived in a splendid, bright little cottage in the clearing where the flowers bloomed and the fairies danced in the moonlight. As you can imagine, Red loved to visit her grandmother's house, and quite often, her and her mother would wrap up a basket of goodies from the baker's shop and go walking down the forest path to grandmother's house. They would spend the day in grandmother's garden, eat homemade soup and goodies from the bakery, and then walk home by the light of the moon and the fireflies. Those were Red's very favorite days. One day, however, grandmother fell ill. And sometimes the very best thing to help someone who is sick is to bring them some of their favorite treats from the bakery. But unfortunately, Red's mother was unable to pack a basket with goodies and take Red through the forest. "Don't worry, Mother," exclaimed Red, already wrapped in her hood. "I am old enough now, and I know the way very well. I can go to grandmother's house and bring her the goodies." It was hard for Red's mother to argue. She had, in fact, grown up quite a bit. Other kids her age were taking trips through the forest on their own, and Red knew the way to her grandmother's house like the back of her hand. She pondered for a moment, as mothers tend to do, and decided it was time to let Red embark on this trip by herself. So, together, they packed up a basket of goodies, a little bit of medicine, and a bottle of raspberry cordial. Before Red's mother handed over the basket, she looked her in the eyes, the way one does when they are saying something very important. "My dear, sweet girl, I trust you and believe in you so much, but you need to know that not everyone is worthy of our trust. If you meet someone, anyone at all that you don't know, then do not trust them. Do not listen to them and do not talk to them. Just follow the path until you get to the clearing where grandmother lives." Red understood her mother's warning, but she was very excited to get going on her big adventure and nearly dropped the basket of goodies right on the ground, but was able to keep everything safe in the basket. Then she walked out the door, waved to her mother, and skipped along the path to her beloved grandmother's house. The forest was beautiful, and especially so in the springtime. The forest floor would be covered in a carpet of enchanted flowers so splendid that Red couldn't help but stare at them and think about how much her grandmother would love them. Surely there wouldn't be any harm in picking a few to add to her basket. Unfortunately, it was while she was stooped to pick the flowers that she caught the attention of a particularly big and bad wolf. "And what would a girl like you be doing alone in the woods like this?" The wolf stood behind Red, polishing his monocle. Of course, it would have served the wolf well to gobble her up right then and there. But he was concerned that a father with an axe or an angry mob of people may be lurking nearby. And it is always wise for wolves to be safe rather than sorry. Red was startled by the sudden appearance of the wolf and nearly dropped her basket. Her mother had warned her against talking to any strangers, and she was quite ready not to answer the wolf at all. But she didn't want to be rude, and the wolf seemed to be a kind wolf. So she couldn't see any problem with talking to him. "I'm on my way to my grandmother's house. She's quite ill, and so I'm bringing her treats from the bakery." At this, the wolf's ears pricked up, for it is not general knowledge these days, but wolves are particularly fond of treats from bakeries, and the thought of gobbling up Red as an appetizer and then the grandmother as a main course seemed very appealing to the wolf. But he knew that they were far too close to town for the wolf to do anything at just that moment. And so he hatched a rather clever plan. "Well, you are far too young to be traveling all the way to your grandmother's house from here." The wolf made sure to sound appropriately concerned, as any well-meaning adult might. "It isn't that far, just to the enchanted clearing past the old bridge." The wolf contemplated her words for a moment and nodded his head sagely. "I suppose that you can handle a trip like that, and perhaps just a little bit more as well. You know, I know of a place where the flowers are even more amazing than these, and may be so perfect as to cure your grandmother on sight. It is hardly out of your way, and after all, isn't your poor, sickly grandmother worth the extra 5 minutes of effort?" He looked very earnest indeed, taking his top hat off his head and clutching it to his chest, staring off into the sky as if inspiration from the very heavens above had struck him. Red needed little convincing because her grandmother would have been worth a great deal more effort than 5 minutes anyway. The girl nodded her head. "Oh, yes, please. Show me where." The wolf got down on his knee and pointed his paw over a nearby hill. "Just over that hill. I promise you can't miss it." Red thanked the wolf and took off towards the patch of flowers, as the wolf wrung his paws in a particularly villainous way before taking off down the road toward the grandmother's cottage. The wolf was certainly right about the flowers. They were only about 5 minutes out of the way, though he may have exaggerated the perfection of the blooms just a bit. They were quite lovely, though, and so Red stooped to pick them until she had a full and lovely bouquet. She was very pleased with herself. After all, her mother and grandmother were sure to be pleased with how grown-up she was to think of adding flowers to the basket. Once the girl was satisfied, she pranced down the path to her grandmother's house. She made her way over the old bridge and into the enchanted clearing, smiling as soon as she saw that familiar cottage. She walked right up to the door and gave 3 firm knocks, just as she had seen her mother do dozens of times. From somewhere, deep within the house, came a gravelly and frail-sounding voice. "Come in." Red furrowed her brow. Her grandmother sounded very sickly indeed. She opened the door and burst into the room, holding the basket above her head. "Grandmother, I have brought you a basket of goodies, medicine, and raspberry cordial. Oh, and flowers, too." She grinned at that last part, still very proud of her thoughtfulness. She walked to the grandmother's bedside and found, even in the very dim lighting, that the old woman looked far worse than she had imagined. "Oh, grandmother, what big eyes you have. All the better to, see you with." The grandmother, as you may have already guessed, was actually the wolf in disguise. He had arrived several minutes before Red, had knocked on the door, and found the grandmother fast asleep in her bed. He hadn't any time to gobble her up, so he scooped the old woman up and hid her away in the pantry so that he could dress in her nightclothes and fool the little girl who would soon be arriving. The wolf cleared his throat in an attempt to sound slightly more like the old woman. "Oh, and perhaps to see that lovely basket you have made for me. Maybe you could hand Granny some of the goodies inside." You sound very ill, grandmother. I believe Mother would think you should start with the medicine. As much as wolves love eating goodies, and kindly old ladies along with their granddaughters, they hate medicine. The wolf could not help but make a face and turn up his nose. "No, no, no. A piece of cake will do much better," the wolf replied, just as one of his big, soft, wolfy ears popped out of the grandmother's sleeping cap. "Grandmother, what big ears you have! All the better to hear you with." The wolf leaned in toward the basket, growing very impatient. But leaning in made his head dip into a beam of light that shone through the window, highlighting his sharp, wolfy teeth. In every person's life, there comes a moment, usually many of them, when they discover that they have made a very big mistake. It was upon seeing her grandmother's big, wolfy teeth that Red had one of these moments. "Grandmother, what big teeth you have! All the better to eat you with." The wolf, realizing he had been discovered, leapt from the bed and reached for Red's basket. This would have been the wolf's best chance at getting a basket full of goodies, an appetizer of Little Red Riding Hood, and a main course of a sleeping grandmother. But there were two things he had not prepared for. The first was that Red was very fast and very loud when she wanted to be. The second was that there was a strong and kindly woodcutter chopping trees just beyond the cottage. Red ran and ran around the house, staying just out of the wolf's claws as she cried loudly for someone to come and help her. The wolf was growing very annoyed and snarled as he tripped over the dressing gown he was wearing. It was about this time that the kindly and strong woodcutter heard the commotion of Red calling for help and the wolf snarling at her. He raced towards Grandmother's cottage and chopped the door down with 3 strong chops of his axe. Getting inside just in time to see the wolf, still dressed in Grandmother's nightclothes, chasing a girl in a red cape around the living room. The only thing that wolves hate more than medicine is large men with axes. For it is easy enough to gobble up a little girl or an old lady, but a large man with an axe is an entirely different story altogether. The wolf's plan had completely failed him, and so his new plan was to run. And run he did. He sped past the woodcutter and out the door, down the path and far away to some unknown region of the forest. The woodcutter, for his part, was still very confused. and became slightly more so when, in the sudden quiet of the room, a soft sound seemed to be coming from the pantry. Both he and Red went to go investigate, and found Red's grandmother fast asleep on the floor, completely unaware of what had happened merely moments before. Red and the woodcutter helped the grandmother over to the table where the three of them enjoyed the goodies and the raspberry cordial. The wolf was never heard from again, but it is still a good idea when walking alone in the enchanted wood to avoid any wolves, because you never quite know what kind of mischief they might be up to. The end.